Hello, friends. Welcome to Science Talk. I am your host, Jim Massa. So what are we looking at here? This very lovely picture. This is from the Arctic. So we see a body of water here, fresh water. We see the tundra right here. And judging by the colors, this is autumn, which means in the Arctic, this is probably mid to late August, perhaps no later than early September. But now, what is this here? Well, that's some slumping of the ground because the permafrost is thawing. The slumping of the ground, and then you get what's called liquefaction, where the ground, especially if it simply was frozen clay or silt, turns into basically a goo. Extremely scientific term, but it's like liquid mud, and has a kind of viscosity to it, but that's why they call it liquefaction, because it kind of gets this consistency to it that if you try to walk on it, you're going to sink right up into your crotch. It's really impossible to travel across this. And we're seeing more and more of such things happening, as if there's an underlying ice lens, where the ice lens melts and itself thaws, you get this slumping, and you get this sort of things here. Another thing, it could be, but highly unlikely given the proximity to the liquid water, but there are features on the Arctic landscape called pingos. P-I-N-G-O is singular. And basically, it looks like a mound, and the mounds could be of varying sizes and heights and so on. And typically, there's a big ice lens in the middle of it. Well, if the ice lens gives way, the whole thing collapses. But usually, when that happens, you still see some of the vegetation on top, although in time, that vegetation could be lost. Be that as it may. But this is a sign of a permafrost ground underneath thawing, and you have the slumping and ensuing liquefaction. This is, of course, from the Canadian Arctic. So how thawing permafrost is beginning to transform the Arctic. Frozen layer of soil that has underlain the Arctic tundra for millennia. Now, millennium is singular, so millennia is the Latin plural. Okay, so it's not millenniums. It's millennia would be the correct Latin plural. So this is for many thousands of years, is now starting to thaw. This thawing, which could release vast amounts of greenhouse gases, is already changing the Arctic landscape by causing landslides, draining lakes, altering vegetation. What's meant by draining lakes? If the ground underneath thaws, then the ground underneath the water can percolate into the ground. Because when the ground is frozen, any water that happens on the surface will accumulate. Now, if that ground starts to thaw underneath there, that water is going to percolate into the ground. That's what they mean by the draining of the lakes. And, of course, altering the vegetation. What does that mean, altering vegetation? If the ground thaws, that means plants that require deeper roots can now move into the region. Tundra plants don't require a deep root. Their roots are in the upper layers of the ground. Plants like willows and other bushes that require deeper roots, that if the ground is frozen, they cannot penetrate deep enough to take hold and establish themselves. Well, the ground thawing out allows them to do so. So that's what they mean by altering vegetation. In other words, the flora will start to move north. And when the flora starts to move north, the fauna will move north with them. And we're seeing this. Okay. So, and of course, the big question, the greenhouse gases, is the methane problem. I've said before many times that if you ask climate scientists what keeps them up at night, it's the methane question, especially from the Arctic region, from potential of the thawing out of the permafrost. Keep in mind, the boreal forest, the northern land masses, is the largest terrestrial biome on the planet. I'll get to more, there's more in this article later on as to the estimated amount of potential carbon stored in the ground. There's another aspect that goes with this, and I did a video on this some time ago where I talked about how, you know, any signs of civilization in the Arctic region is reliant on the ground staying frozen. We build our roads, you know, you build up the roads, you put tailings down, and then you build your, it's basically out of rock. We don't, very rarely do we use asphalt, but you build up your roads and tailing, you build it up on the ground because the ground underneath is assumed to stay frozen, and you drive around on that. Same thing with the building. When you build a structure, there's no such thing as, oh, let's go into the basement. No, you build everything up on the ground, and you build up on the ground so that there is a air gap from the bottom of your floor joist to the ground, so that any cold air will move away any heat that the building gives off. Because any heat that gets into the ground starts to thaw the ground. Well, the ground is thawing. So now we're seeing that some of the buildings are starting to sink into the ground. Some of the roads are sinking into the ground. They're twisting, they're cracking, etc. So I did a segment on that some time ago. You can go check that out. Click on my video tabs and just scroll on down. Look for it, or anything else that catches your fancy. All my videos are there. You know, since day one that I started this channel. So, Canadian scientist Philip Marsh and the author Ed Strudzik were flying along the coast of the Beaufort Sea. Right? Beaufort Sea is northeastern Alaska. It's also and basically where the Yukon Territory, Northwest Territories all meet up there. And frozen tundra recently opened up into a crater the size of a football stadium located along the shoreline of an unnamed lake. The so-called thaw slump was gray, muddy, and barren, in sharp contrast to the russet and gold of the surrounding autumn tundra. That's this photo. This is the size of a football field. That's what he's describing there. These retrogressive thaw slumps or landslides formed as warming temperatures rapidly thaw permafrost are increasing across the Arctic, including the kilometer-long, 100-meter-deep Batagayka crater in the Yana River basin of Siberia. That's a recent development, and it's a portend of some more further such events happening. Okay, there's lots of berries, cranberries, cloudberries, blueberries, etc. Bears love it. Okay, as the Arctic warms faster than any region on Earth, public attention has largely been focused on the rapid disappearance of Arctic sea ice, and it's important to pay attention to that. But major changes are also taking place on land, and one of the most striking is the thawing of vast sections of permafrost that have underlain these polar regions for millennia. That thaw is taking a toll in complex ways that are not totally clearly understood, and scientists are working hard to understand it better. Some 2.5 million square miles of permafrost, 40% of the world's total, could disappear by the end of the century. And that, of course, has enormous consequences. The most alarming is expected to be the release of huge amounts of methane, carbon dioxide, and now nitrous oxide has now been shown to be released from the permafrost. Nitrous oxide is another greenhouse gas. I did a recent video segment discussing that very issue of nitrous oxide. Less well appreciated are the sweeping landscape changes that will alter tundra ecosystems. I kind of just alluded to that. You're going to see changes in the vegetation, and as the flora moves north, so will the fauna that typically associated with that flora will also move north. But this will make it, the indigenous people who rely on a subsistence mode of lifestyle, will make it more difficult for them, because what they've come to expect and rely on will no longer be consistent, will be different, making it more of a challenge for them. And the Inuits, also Arctic animals, will be hard pressed to find food. The disintegration of subterranean ice that keeps everything together, peat, clay, rock, sand, etc., is now triggering landslides and slumping at alarming rates, resulting in stream flows changing, lakes suddenly draining, seashores collapsing, and water chemistry changing. I described earlier what's meant by the water draining, because the ground underneath thaws out and the water simply percolates into the ground below. But seashores collapsing. There's been a couple of villages in Alaska that had to relocate, move the entire village, buildings and everything, because literally the ground around them was dropping off into the ocean. All this thawing of the permafrost, the ground was slumping, and boom, there goes another 50 feet of real estate into the ocean. Seriously, just huge chunks of land dropping off. Now, if you have a lake that is close to a shoreline and a shoreline slump, that's certainly a fast way to drain a lake. And this Dr. Marsh is a former Canadian government scientist. He's a professor of hydrology at Wilfrid Laurier University in Ontario. Much as 80% of the ground here consists of frozen water. When that ice melts, the frozen ground literally falls apart. As a result, said Marsh, Indigenous communities, the resource industry, and the government need to better understand how a warming climate is impacting water resources and permafrost ecosystems. So here's a little setup of some equipment on the tundra. And this is in the Northwest Territories. This person is Brendan Walker. He's a researcher from the Wilfrid Laurier University. You know, they've got, he's been working here for basically for 30 years almost. So he's in what's called the Trail Valley Creek. So he's got a research station there. There's a photo here. I'll show you the, where is that? So this is science, folks. This is how we do it. Not very glamorous. You know, pounding something into the ground, marking a station. This is a sediment core where you can do all sorts of chemical analyses and other analyses on it, including isotopic fractionation. And where I want to show, yeah, this is the research station. There it is. Literally in the middle of nowhere. And how do they access it? Helicopter. So these are, what you see here are boardwalks that minimizes the impact of the tundra vegetation. There's some, you know, some buildings, you know, housing, labs, that kind of stuff. And all these little various stations to collect data. There it is, right in the middle of nowhere. And it's situated along the Mackenzie Delta, which you can see in the background here. I've been to the Mackenzie Delta numerous times, taken ice core samples. So this is not too far from where I used to, one of the many places I used to go to. Mackenzie River Delta, the Beaufort Sea, Chukchi Sea, all along that part of the Arctic Ocean. Okay, so it's also, so the site that he chose is the site of a new Arctic highway. Hundreds of now dormant exploratory oil and gas drilling sites. And let me pause right there. There's a large amount of gas in the Mackenzie River Delta. And pipelines are being proposed to, you know, get that gas and then ship it down to, you know, the lower provinces and the lower 48 states. Same thing up on the North Slope of Alaska. There's gas. The ANWR, the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, they want to open that up for drilling for oil and gas and so on. There's a lot of fossil fuels up there, and people are fighting to keep it in the ground, but there are forces that want to extract that. So that's the side of a battlefield. But when you punch these roads through, you do major, major damage to the ground underneath, major disruption of the ecosystem, as well as major disruption for the caribou as they migrate. Lots of times the caribou will come up to these roads and they don't want to cross it. So, and if they can't get to their preferred calving grounds to have their calves, well, that's going to be detrimental to population dynamics. Also, what's important in the tundra, you get bird nesting territory. You get a lot of bird species that are ground nesters. They're going to be affected. And of course, any industrialization of the region is going to impact those species as well. I love this one. Like all permafrost scientists, he and colleagues have worked in arduous conditions, fighting off hordes of biting flies and mosquitoes in the summer and measuring snowpack and ground temperatures in the nasty, nasty winter. The mosquitoes can get so thick that you need to wear a head net. You just have to. Because if you don't, if you open your mouth, you get a load of mosquitoes in your mouth. It sounds gross, but that's how it is up there. One reason that Area 1002 of ANWR is so critical is that's where they want to drill, but it's right on the coastal plain, and the caribou are so tormented by the mosquitoes that they run into the oceanic waters to get away from the mosquitoes. Well, they want to put the industrial sprawl right there on the coastal plain that will block the caribou from getting into the ocean. And by the way, the mosquitoes can drain 1 to 2 pints of blood per day from the caribou. And I won't even get into bot flies. That's kind of disgusting. But that's another thing caribous have to deal with. So this area is a challenge to do research in. And that's how it is. So Dr. Marsh's research has already led him to conclude that climate warming will result in hydrological changes this century that will dry up 15,000 of the 45,000 lakes in the Mackenzie River Delta alone. That's 1/3. It's one of the largest deltas in the world. He also expects to see more of what Anthony Lukowitz, a geographer and permafrost expert at the University of Ottawa, is seeing farther north on Banks Island in the high Arctic of Canada. Lukowitz recently reported a 60-fold increase in slumping along 288 lakes that he has monitored with satellite imagery from 1984 to 2015. Basically a 31-year record. This is alarming. Right here, that I'm running the cursor over. An estimated 1,400 gigatons of carbon are frozen in the Arctic permafrost, making it one of the world's largest carbon sinks. Well, as the permafrost thaws, it now becomes a carbon source, no longer a carbon sink. And now, as it starts thawing, the bacterial action starts working on the materials that's in there. And next thing you know, we have CO2, methane, nitrous oxide being released. Those are powerful greenhouse gases. They trap more heat, increase the thawing rate, increase more gases being released, so on and so forth. Another positive feedback loop. Slumping can occur with sudden catastrophic force. In one notable case that was actually captured on film, 2015, by Steve Kokelj, who's a permafrost expert with the Northwest Territories Geologic Survey, A rapidly thawing cliff bordering the shores of a tundra lake collapsed into the Peel River watershed in Northwest Territories. The waterfall that was created drained approximately 800,000 gallons of water from that upland lake in just 2 hours. Heavy metals in the permafrost, such as mercury, were flushed downstream along with silt and peat, basically changing that river ecosystem for quite some distance. Now, permafrost. Permafrost is basically permanently frozen ground. Now, there may be a seasonal thaw layer, and you have thaw stable, thaw unstable permafrost. Some time ago, I did a video explaining permafrost, so again, please check that out. But it occurs in areas where the temperature of the ground remains below the freezing mark for 2 years or more. About 1/4 of the Northern Hemisphere landscape fits this definition. Most of the world's permafrost is found in northern Russia, Canada, Alaska, Iceland, Scandinavia. Much of it underlies peat ecosystem. But like peat, permafrost is also found in the Rocky Mountains of Canada and Alaska, i.e. up at elevation, the Alps, Himalayas, the high altitude Patagonia region of South America, and the high country of New Zealand. The rapid thawing permafrost has enormous implications for climate change, and as we said before, it estimated 1,400 gigatons of carbon. Now, that amount of carbon is about 4 times more than what humans have emitted since the Industrial Revolution. Twice as much is currently contained in the atmosphere. Let that sink in. There's a potential to release 1,400 gigatons of carbon frozen in the permafrost because the planet is warming, because of the gases we've already put into the atmosphere. And that amount that potentially could be released is 4 times more than what humans have already released, twice as much as what we have in the atmosphere now. So what we have in the atmosphere, if we measure CO2 parts per million, it's about 416 or so. So if you roughly double that, we're talking, what, 832? Well, when you get levels that high, you're going to have a hothouse Earth. According to a recent report, a 2 degrees Celsius increase in temperature, which is 3.6 Fahrenheit, which is what the models are calling at a minimum by the end of the century, will result in a loss of about 40% of the permafrost, the world's permafrost, by 2100. Greenhouse gases on the tundra are released in 2 ways. Permafrost thaws. Once dormant microorganisms begin to act on organic matter, allowing methane and carbon to be released in the atmosphere. I've described that for you guys many times before. Thawing can also open pathways for methane to rise up from reservoirs deep in the earth. Now, in the ground, you have what are called methane clathrates. And they're basically where you have frozen methane gases in the as part of the clump of frozen ground, whatever. That ground thaws, that methane gets released. These tend to be found deep in the ground where the increased pressure can keep that methane in the liquid form, not the gaseous form. You also have methane hydrates found in the bottom of deep lakes, oceans, seafloor bed, that kind of stuff. That again, there is basic combination of methane and water. It's frozen, and as you release the pressure and or warm it up, it turns into a methane gas, and that is also released. There's numerous film footage from Norwegian scientists showing methane bubbling out of the ground in lakes and oceans, that kind of stuff there. And that's the methane hydrates melting, because the ice does melt. The permafrost thawing is intensifying across the Arctic. Much of the permafrost degradation that has occurred on Canada's Banks Island took place after some of the warmest years on record, according to Lukowitz. In 1984, the island had 60 active slumps. By 2013, there were 4,000 Ha! Lukowitz expects that the island may see as many as 30,000 new active slumps in the coming years. Thawing will have a profound impact on the flow and chemistry of lakes and streams, as well as those parts of the Arctic Ocean into which rivers drain. The Beaufort Sea, the Mackenzie River Delta drains into the Beaufort Sea. Lukowitz's satellite data shows that the color of many of the lakes on Banks Island have changed from blue to turquoise, indicating that the once clear water has become filled with sediments. I don't know how many times you've seen glacial lakes that have that turquoise color. That's because of the silt. As the water comes down from the mountains and so on, that is in the water, giving it that turquoise sediment color. That's what we're basically seeing here. Scientists suspect that some of the slumping may be giving new life to pathogens capable of killing musk oxen, caribou, nesting birds, as warmer temperatures nudge the pathogens out of their dormant state. Massive die-offs of musk oxen on Banks and Victoria Islands in Canada, as well as reindeer in Siberia, appear to be related to once dormant pathogens that are coming back to life. Now, everyone is talking about the COVID-19, understandably so. But the permafrost is thawing out, right? We know that. We're discussing that right here. I have said before, we don't know what pathogens are lying dormant in the permafrost that will then no longer be dormant but come to life once they thaw out of the permafrost. And what pathogens are there, not only for muskox and caribou birds, humans. There are going to be pathogens there that have been locked away for 30, 40,000 years. Chances are no humans today have, or unless some of the northern indigenous folks there, but we don't know what these pathogens can do to us. They'll probably run right through us and create high mortality. So this is another major concern that you really don't hear mentioned, but I'm mentioning it. As the permafrost thaws, not only talk about with the changes to the biomes and ecosystems and the structure of society, roads, houses, we're talking about potentially releasing pathogens that can basically result in high fatalities of not only whatever the local fauna is, but humans as well. This is a major concern that I have, and everyone should have. Here's an interesting thing. The date when snow melts is key to determining the rate at which the permafrost thaws. Snow is an insulatory cover. Right? So if you have a layer of snow, and again, snow is white, any sun energy coming down, it's going to be reflected off. It's not going to reach the ground itself. If the snow melts earlier, that protective cover is no longer there. Now you have sun energy reaching the darker colored vegetation, green, brown versus white. That sun energy is absorbed. It leads to the thawing, heat energy being absorbed by the permafrost, and the thawing ensues. Scientists find that hundreds of sumps excavated by the oil and gas industry in the 70s and 80s are thawing. Toxic petroleum waste that was supposed to be permanently contained in 200 frozen pits in the Mackenzie River is now making their way into the nearby freshwater systems. Oh, yay. So Trail Valley Creek, Carolina Voigt, a postdoctoral geography researcher, and Oliver Sonnentag, a hydrologist at the University of Montreal, are using manual and automated sensors to measure how climate change affects greenhouse gas activity on the tundra. Evan Wilcox, a geography PhD candidate at Wilfrid Laurier University, has made important discoveries about the role that the rapid expansion of shrubs in the Arctic, the result of rising temperatures, is playing in the thawing of permafrost. What did I say earlier? That as the ground thaws and the layer of ground that's no longer frozen, it goes deeper and deeper. This allows for vegetation that require deeper roots to start expanding their range northward. This is exactly what's going on. Shrubs are expanding into tundra where grasses, sedges, and lichens once prevailed. Not only are the taller shrubs shading out the smaller plants below, they're changing the hydrology of the ecosystem. Wilcox says that we're finding that the day when snow melts is key to determining the rate at which the active layer permafrost thaws. The active layer is something that's called a seasonal thaw layer, where it will thaw out seasonally, but refreezes come the next winter. Below that is where you find the ground where it's permanently frozen and stays frozen. Well, not only is the seasonal thaw layer getting deeper and deeper, but now we're moving into that permanently frozen ground, and that is now thawing out. So you've got the active layer, the seasonal thaw layer, and then the stuff all below that's all thawing out. Snow in tundra areas where you have shrubs such as dwarf birch tends to melt a week earlier than it does in areas where there are no shrubs. This results in more permafrost thawing. As the shrubs expand into the tundra, we're likely to see an acceleration of thawing. Makes sense. Their roots are penetrating deeper. So you have another positive feedback loop set up here. You're having a situation where the permafrost is thawing. This allows plants that require deeper roots. As the plants expand their range north and take hold, their being there increases the thawing as well. So you have a two-pronged approach to the increased thawing. I showed you this before. So Wilcox bores steel probes as many as 3,000 one recent summer into the ground to determine the depths of ground thaw. That's what they're doing here. Pounding that in. But you can see here's some of those shrubs moving in. Compare that to, let's see, what is that other photo? Yeah, you look here, here's some grasses and stuff. This here kind of like white or cream color, off-white color, that's lichen. This is what caribou subsist on. Yeah, this is all lichen right here. You've got some little sedges and grasses and so forth. Oh, no, that's a lot of hard work. They're sitting there pounding stuff into ice. You know, basically what they're doing. And so Weiss has conducted permafrost research in Siberia, Scandinavia, and Canada. He and others have found that carbon storage and the ways gases released in its ecosystems depend on a variety of factors such as the composition of the soil, groundwater flow, and whether trees, shrubs, or grasses are predominant. What's clear, he says, that even in the coldest places in the Arctic, permafrost is thawing at accelerating rates. Although much remains to be discovered about the impacts of thawing permafrost, Mars says one thing is becoming increasingly clear. In the coming decades, the tundra landscape will look much different than it does now. There you have it. Big changes are underway. By the way, I also want to mention here, I mean, granted, they were focusing in this article on the Canadian scientists at work, but and it's more like because these two people are friends of mine, and they were the pioneers doing this work of examining what's happening with the permafrost and looking at, you know, methane, CO2 releases, etc. And that's Igor Semiletov and his wife Natalia. Two super, super nice people, two really excellent scientists. And as you can tell from the name, Igor Semiletov, they're from Russia, but they did a lot of pioneering work across Siberia, looking at the permafrost. So I wanted to give a shout out to them because they helped start it all. going to places where not too many people would go, collecting some of the baseline data that's important, so we can make your comparative analyses and so on. So, here's your next generation of folks coming in and picking up the mantle and running with it. But I wanted to give an acknowledgement to Igor and Natalia, two excellent scientists, two really nice people. So, as we saw in this article here, to kind of think of this as like an update. I'll be looking forward to when the articles are published and when their findings are published in peer-reviewed journals. But this is usually, I usually don't do such stories. I usually stick to the peer-reviewed journals articles, but this is kind of like ongoing, just like my, this Arctic sea ice. That's kind of an ongoing, keep you like, this is what's coming down the pipe, and we'll look for the reports when they get published. But we do know that the Arctic is changing, the permafrost is thawing. This has profound changes on everything, as we discussed here in this video segment. So hope you found this informative. Of course, I will be following this to see what their findings are and any other related research. So thank you for your time, and we'll talk soon. Hello, folks. This is Jim here with Science Talk, asking you to please subscribe to my channel and to inform others of my channel and of the work that I do. Please share to social media platforms that you use. Also, as a reminder, don't forget to click the bell so that you know when I load up more videos. Finally, I ask that you support the work that I do by becoming a patron at patreon.com. Details in the description box below. Thank you for your support.